I love doing these. I totally get why reading wrap-ups are popular. They're really fun to make. I don't know why they're fun to make. Just got a pile of books that you've already read and you just talk about them. I mention this every single time, but almost every book on my reading wrap-up list of each month has its own dedicated video or is featured in a video somewhere. And that's kind of true again here, but also no. And you'll see why. Anyway, I've read, I think, 11 books this month. Let's jump in. This was the first book that I read in June, and it has its own dedicated video review that you can go watch. This is The Woman in the Purple Skirt. It's written by Natsuko Imamura and translated by Lucy North, who did a really great job translating this book. It's a strange little tale, very, very short. I read it in a day. It's a Japanese novel, and it tells the story of a woman who is known as the Woman in the Yellow Cardigan. She is our narrator and our first-person protagonist, and she is obsessed with the titular Woman in the Purple Skirt, who's a woman in her neighborhood who flits between jobs and life situations, and our protagonist wants to help her, and she does so completely from the shadows. The woman in the purple skirt doesn't even know she exists, and the woman in the yellow cardigan gets her a job at the hotel that she works for, and then from there it's kind of almost like the woman in the yellow cardigan becomes an omniscient narrator, as she just watches the woman in the purple skirt make friends, do her job, get used to her responsibilities, and it escalates from there and gets increasingly strange. I really, really enjoyed this book. It was a lovely start to the month. This is another book that I have a dedicated video review for. Please go watch it because this was my most anticipated novel of the entire year. Heaven by Mieko Kawakami. It's translated by Sam Bett and David Boyd, published by Picador. Almost exactly a year ago, Kawakami put out in translation by Sam Bett and David Boyd, Breasts and Eggs, which was my favourite book of 2020. This is going to be at the top of my list of favourite books of this year. I don't know if it'll be number one. We're only halfway through the year. We'll have to see, but it has certainly left a lasting impression, and it was exactly as good as I hoped it would be. Heaven is a story about bullying in school. I was bullied at school. I related heavily to this. This is a book about two kids who get to find some sort of camaraderie, friendship, pseudo-romance between each other as they find solace in their really terrible situation. But it is more prominently told from the boy's perspective, and his situation is really dire. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I said a lot in my video, and you can go watch that. But Heaven was my most anticipated book of the year, especially Japanese book, and it didn't disappoint. I think that's all you really need to know to give my video a watch if you haven't already, and go pick this book up. It really is exactly as good as you hope it would be. Good doesn't mean nice though. It's not nice, but it's very good. I think this was the next thing I read. I can't remember. I also did a video on this. This is V.E. Schwab's The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. It's my first V.E. Schwab book, and I keep looking at her other books and thinking, ooh, which one next? Because I loved this book. I said in my video, this has become kind of a new favorite of mine, and I'm already thinking about rereading it. I really enjoyed it. The comments for that video pointed out a few things that I hadn't really considered. One was that Addie isn't that interesting a character based on what she's seen and done, and the boy that she meets, Henry, is a far more interesting character, and I think I do agree with that. I found Addie likable enough, especially because this reminded me of the works of Neil Gaiman, and his protagonists are particularly boring, and I say that as a fan. And Addie was a lot more interesting than those, so maybe I was just making that comparison, but yeah, Henry's a far more damaged and dimensionalized character than Addie is. And another thing is that this book is very, very Eurocentric, very, very white. There are no characters of color in it. One commenter even mentioned that apparently somewhere in the book, Addie remarks that she only ever met one black person or something. I didn't catch this when I read it, but it did immediately piss me off and made me kind of reevaluate this book, and I'm thinking, do I jump back in, see it from a different lens? I don't know. Either way, it's definitely worth considering. It's kind of annoying. It definitely makes the book flawed and kind of naive as a text. I still really enjoyed this book. It's pretty big, and I did say in my video it could have been a bit shorter, but the pros hugely outweighed the cons. I thought this was such a wonderful world to live in, such a fantastic story with just enough twists and turns to keep you guessing and keep you turning the pages. I really enjoyed it. It is now probably my favorite piece of urban, modern fantasy fiction, whatever you want to call it. Magic realism, I don't know. Fantasy that's not set in a fantasy world. I really liked it. Warts and all. Following that, I read the winner of the International Booker Prize 2021, At Night All Blood is Black by David Diop, translated into English from French by Anna Moshovakis. This is a World War I book. After I read this and did a video on it, I realized how many books and poetry I've read from and about World Wars I and II, so I wrote a very, very big list detailing all the books, all my favorite books that are set during World Wars I and II, all fiction, but some poetry, by obviously Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, the two big World War I poets. I read a lot of these books, and I'm not a war nut. I'm not obsessed with war. I don't watch war documentaries. I find it all so hypermasculine and a little bit weird and a little bit nationalistic. It's all a bit boomer, a little bit cishet. Not a fan. But I have read a lot. And because most of them are anti-war books with poignant messages, and I do kind of enjoy this trench warfare setting, so surprise myself there. Either way, I wrote that list, you can go check it out, I'll put it in the description. At Night All Blood is Black is a really incredible novel. It's a hard hitter, and it tells the story of a Senegalese soldier who joins the French army during World War I, and it's a book about toxic masculinity. Rather than camaraderie, it's about the darker side of camaraderie, which is toxic masculinity. It's also very poignantly a book about racism. Even when you're facing down enemy soldiers, even when you have bigger fish to fry, much bigger threats, much more on your plate, you still somehow have time as a soldier in the trenches getting sick and getting shot at to be racist, and I find that fascinating. It's a very poignant, dark book, very, very visceral, bloody, nasty. It's very, very short. I read it in a single sitting on a sunny day, which hasn't happened in a while now. Thank you, Britain. It's obvious why it won the Booker, and I do think it deserved it. It wasn't my favourite of the ones that I read from the long list, but only in the sense that the one that is my favourite is a little bit more fun, and I read a lot of dark literary fiction like this, and sometimes I need fun. So for that reason, it's hard to call this my favourite, but it's probably the one that deserved to win. I can't really say because I didn't read them all. Anyway, go watch my video and you'll have a lot more thoughts on this. Speaking of fun, this was a very pleasant and welcome surprise. I made a video about Independent Bookshop Week, which happened in June. Buy our t-shirt, it's still on sale. The Reader's Room came along with that. The publisher, Gallic, sent us this book. This is the special Independent Bookshop edition. There are like 3 different covers you can get of this book, and this particular color-coded cover is exclusive to independent bookshops in the UK, so if you're there, go check it out. This is definitely the nicest cover, which I'm really glad about, because if the Waterstones one was better, I'd be annoyed. Anyway, The Reader's Room is a French novel. It's a crime novel. It's very, very Agatha Christie. So not really crime, more murder mystery. And I guess they are different genres. I really liked this. I found that I liked it less as I went on towards the end. When I made my video on Independent Bookshop Week, I mentioned this book. I was only halfway through at the time, and then I finished it the next day, and I didn't like the murder mystery as much as I expected to. What I liked more was the general setting and the mood and the tone and the characters that are established in the first half, which is all to do with publishing. It's set in a publishing house in Paris. It's about the woman who's the head of the publishing house, how she got there, her relationship with her husband and her colleagues, and what it's like working there, what the industry is like, but in a pretty romantic way. And I really found that so charming. And then when the murder side of the murder mystery starts to creep in, which still is never at the forefront actually, it became a little bit less interesting. A mystery story set in a publishing house was just so alluring to me, and now I want more fiction set in publishing houses, which is why next month I am definitely going to be reading a big bestseller of this moment, which is The Other Black Girl, which is set in a New York City publishing house. I cannot wait to read that book. The Reader's Room is very charming. It was written by Antoine Lorraine, I didn't mention that, and it was translated by 3 different people at Gallic Books, and I'll put all of their names here. It's lovely. It's not perfect as a murder mystery, definitely, but I really think it's still worth reading based on its characters, its charm, its setting, and its tone. Next is this, The Membranes by Chi Tao Wei, translated from Chinese into English by Ari Larissa Heinrich. Whew, this is a great book. I didn't do a dedicated video on it. Instead, I featured it in a list of LGBTQ books from around the world, kind of specially made for Pride Month, but also made because I just read this and we already have a written article about that exact topic, and I wanted to add this to that list, and then I turned that list into a video. Anyway, The Membranes, really, really good. It was originally written in 1995. Cheetah Wei and I have since had a few interactions on Twitter, and he's just the loveliest guy. I'm very proud of how forward-thinking this book is, considering when it was written. Even written today, this is the kind of book that pushes boundaries when it comes to heteronormativity and relationship standards, the conservative situation that we all live in, the status quo of straight couples having kids, getting married, all of this stuff. It bucks a lot of those trends, and to do that back in the 90s, it's just really cool and punk. It's a science fiction novel, it's queer, it's about a lesbian couple, it's about a protagonist who is a young trans woman. I cannot tell you how and why her story of being trans is explored, because that is integral to a lot of the twists, turns, the philosophies, the themes. There's a lot to unpack. It's a short novel, really short, you'll read it in a weekend. I loved it. I really, really loved The Membranes. It's a fantastic piece of science fiction. It's very, very queer, but in a very philosophical and academic way. But that doesn't mean it's dry or bland or boring in any way. It really isn't. It is a page-turner of a science fiction novel, and it's very, very character-focused and relationship-led. Loved it. With regards to books that I've already done videos on, I have one more to mention, but I'm going to mention it at the end, and I'm now going to bring up 3 books that I've also read that I haven't mentioned at all in any videos, and there is a reason for that. First up is this, Mrs. England. This is by Stacey Halls, one of my favourite contemporary British writers of historical fiction. I think historical fiction is fantastic, I'm obsessed with it. I read a lot of historical fiction. I've done a specific video about Stacey Halls and her previous 2 books, The Foundling and The Familiars, which you can see behind me. There's a reason there's a big gap in the shelf, and that's because it's half these books. Mrs. England was a lovely, lovely read, but I really don't want to talk about it too much because next month I'll be doing a dedicated video on all of the most recent historical fiction that I've been enjoying, and this is one of them. I'm currently reading Fingersmith by Sarah Waters, which is my first Sarah Waters novel. I'm about 150 pages in and really enjoying it. It is long though, and very dense, but very beautifully written. Anyway, I've read a whole bunch of historical fiction recently and I want to do a dedicated video. I have done dedicated videos in the past, so this is just another one. And I'm not going to tell you anything about Mrs. England because I'll talk about it a lot in that video. Next up is this. I don't really know what to do with this in terms of making a video, so I don't know if I will. So I'll talk about it here. This is I'm Afraid of Men by Vivek Shraya. Vivek Shraya is a Canadian trans woman and musician. She has started to write more and more books recently. She wrote The Subtweet, I think last year, and people loved that book. I have it, I'm going to read it as soon as possible. This is a tiny, tiny little manifesto. It is 80 pages. I read it in a cafe one afternoon in London, and I really felt seen by this book in a huge way. Vivek Shraya came out as trans at the age of 35-ish and is now around the age of 40, and she's a pretty prominent singer-songwriter. Up until that point, she had struggled with men, masculinity, etc. The title of the book really says everything. I'm Afraid of Men. Now, as someone who has passed as straight for years, who has passed as cisgender for years, I have always been terrified of men and masculinity myself, without being able to justify that in any way, because I wasn't identifying as a woman, I wasn't identifying as queer, I was just so terrified of masculinity. Men frighten me, in the same way that men frighten a lot of people. Masculinity is a scary thing, and that's what this book is about. It's somewhere between a memoir and a manifesto for change, when we consider toxic masculinity and how masculinity in our society makes so many other people so afraid, intimidated, on edge, etc. The only problem with it is that it actually doesn't do a lot as a manifesto. It is mostly a memoir. And what you learn about her life in the memoir is very relatable. You'll feel very empathetic towards her, but the manifesto side of it is just kind of a few pages at the end when she says, I wish things were more like this. And it's kind of empty. It doesn't really give a lot of actionable advice to the world on how we could change things. But I appreciated her memoir, and I really appreciated how much I related to it because I felt a lot less alone as a person who gets so intimidated by masculinity in general. It's like that meme, I'm in this picture and I don't like it. I really felt it. For the same reason I didn't say anything about Mrs. England by Stacey Halls, I'm not going to say anything here about Assembly by Natasha Brown. This is a book I only just finished reading. Again, it is tiny, it is exactly 100 pages, but it sometimes reads more like a collection of sparse ideas and bits of poetry. It is a very disjointed, very sparse, very loose and empty kind of a book, and it will take you an afternoon to read. I loved it. It hurt a lot, and I will talk about it in a bit more detail in a video because I'm thinking of doing a video dedicated to the contemporary novels of modern day black women writers. I'm still not sure if I'm going to make this video, only because I'm worried that it might come off as patronizing. I'm very aware of that, we'll see. But I've read a lot of great books by black women, especially contemporary novels, especially recently, and I just want to talk about them, and it gives me a kind of theme to go off so I can talk about them all in a list. We'll see if I feel like making that video is a good idea, but Assembly will be on it. Right now, this is a big new book. Natasha Brown is a black British writer, and this is her debut novel. It's difficult. It's not an easy read. Very, very beautifully written. I can't believe it's a debut novel. I really recommend it, and if that's enough for you to pick it up, great. But I will be saying a lot more about it when the video comes around, if the video comes around. And the very last thing I want to talk about is Black Box. I have just done a video on this. It was the last video I did before this one. Black Box by Shiori Ito, translated by Alison Markin Powell. This is a non-fiction manifesto for change. Again, it takes Shiori Ito's personal experience of being sexually assaulted and turns that into something useful for society, actionable. It is a rallying cry to women, to victims of sexual assault of any sex or gender or sexuality. It has sparked Japan's Me Too movement, and it is pushing us towards changing laws and politics and the way that people think and feel and talk about sexual assault and sexual abuse. I won't say anything more about it because I did a whole video review on it. This is a very, very important, necessary book for right now, for any time, until change, real, drastic change, is done on a global scale. Okay, so we are done. My next video will be a lineup of all the great books coming out in July that I have review copies of and I'm excited to talk about and I'm hoping are going to be good books. See you there, see you then. You look great, well done. Subscribe for books.